In my previous entry, I went into this question of who was more likely to have written A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens or Matthew Franklin Whittier, meaning the opening, because I think the opening of the carol was written by Matthew, and then later on Abby made her contributions. And I started out with Matthew's earliest work, or not absolutely earliest, but his early work from 1831, 1832 in the New York Constellation. That's before Dickens was publishing fiction. And I read several of those pieces, just the opening 2-3 paragraphs. So I'm going to continue with that because scholars want style comparison. So we're going to do style comparison. I'm going to move forward to the early 1840s, before A Christmas Carol was published, but certainly not before Charles Dickens had published a number of works. And I'm going to stick with a pseudonym that I absolutely know is Matthew's work. And first I have to talk about how I know that. And when I say no, I don't mean that, I'm 99% sure. I'm 100% sure on this. So Matthew's brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, writes to him on February 7th, 1843, "We were much amused by thy article in the Transcript about avalanche slides, etc. I got the other day the first number of thy traveling sketches, and we like it much." So these are two pieces that John Greenleaf Whittier is referring to that are clearly written by Matthew, because on the first case he says thy article, and in the second case he says thy traveling sketches. Okay, so the traveling sketches, there's a series of 3 or 4, I forget which, called Travels in the East. It's a little travelogue, and it's signed Poins, P-O-I-N-S, which is a Shakespearean character that Matthew apparently identified with in some sense. And it turns out that there are quite a number of pieces in the early, this is the Portland Transcript, signed Poins. Not just this travelogue, but there are poems and there are stories, short stories, and quite a number of things. And that goes on for 2-3 years in the transcript. So definitely everything in the Portland Transcript signed Poins is written by Matthew Franklin Whittier. There's no way around this, okay? So that's definite. So we're just going to stick with that because there could have been some question in anybody's mind as to the things I read the previous entry. Oh, that's not really Matthew Franklin Whittier's work. Well, this is really Matthew Franklin Whittier's work. Now, before we get into that, I went through the works, fictional works that Dickens published before A Christmas Carol. And I can't read them because I know if I stretch these entries out too long, I'm going to lose everybody. So you are quite welcome to go back and look at these yourself. What I'll do is just kind of comment on them. Now, A Dinner at Poplar Walk, 1833, that's the first one, as I read the history. I always have that caveat because I'm not a Dickens scholar, so, I can make mistakes. Doesn't negate everything I say. I make mistakes about Dickens' history. But it's a rather lively, kind of sarcastic introduction to a man named Mr. Augustus Minns, a bachelor of about 40. And it reads rather like some of the kind of lighthearted, sarcastic things that Matthew wrote. But there's a red flag in here. Now, not everybody will agree with me, but again, I have a master's in counseling, okay, for what that's worth, and I have a right to comment on psychological phenomena. So he's talking about this character who is rather a prude. So he talks about the place where he lives, and he says, "There, horror, these were dogs and children. He was not unamenable, but he could at any time have viewed the execution of a dog or the assassination of an infant with the liveliest satisfaction. Their habits were at variance with his love of order, and his love of order was as powerful as his love of life." Now, there's humor and there's humor. This is rough humor, and it's not funny. To me, the execution of a dog or the assassination of an infant is not funny, and I wouldn't use it in casual humor. The only time that Matthew, and I am Matthew in that on this deeper level, emotional level and ethical level. The only time Matthew would ever have used such a thing is if he was deliberately drawing the character of a villain and it was going to be central to the rest of the story. In other words, it's not funny in and of itself, but if it was part of a villain, drawing a villain's character, and that was going to be the theme of the story and was going to come in later, then he might have written something like this to paint what kind of a character he was. Matthew would never have used it casually as though it was funny in itself. This is a big red flag about Dickens' character to me. Anybody else might look at this and it's nothing, it's nothing. Well, it's not nothing. It's if you get to know somebody and they start joking about things like this, about executing dogs and, murdering infants, and he laughs, you better step away from that person, because the chances are there's something really dark underneath. So that's just a little tiny red flag in there. Otherwise, it's, it's humorous, it's light. Matthew clearly didn't catch it because, as we will see in a minute, he was a fan. Now, then there's the Pickwick Papers, 1836, rather. It's nicely introduced. I won't read it. But remember that Matthew wrote in this style before Dickens started publishing fiction before 1830, but 1830, 31, 32 in the New York Constellation. This newspaper could be obtained in England, in London. Apparently, according to my correspondence with the British Library, it was probably not available in reading rooms. That's what she thought, the woman I corresponded with, although I think it could have been, possibly, but that it was available through a subscription. So Dickens could have had a subscription to the Constellation, or he could have obtained it from someone else who had one. It was sent over, see? So technically is important, because if someone's going to attack my work skeptically, they will bring in all these nitpicky technical, this could have been things. When people try to debunk past life regression and a man talks about things that he could have read in a novel, they will use that as, a sufficient evidence to debunk it, see? So I'm saying that Dickens could have read Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in the New York Constellation. So that's the Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby. Now, this is an interesting one. This is 1838, and it's the preface. See, I've said that Matthew would almost always preface his works, including his humorous works, with a serious, and it's like a philosophical introduction. It's not just a statement of facts, but it's a statement of philosophy, see? So this has something similar to that in an actual preface. It's separate from the story. And he talks about the monstrous neglect of education in England and the disregard of it by the state as a means of forming good or bad citizens. And it sounds very ethical and moral and well written. But Dickens was a plagiarist by my lights. I've shown that he was accused of it numerous times, and I'm in the process of proving that he did it with regard to A Christmas Carol. I feel I've proven that. So if you're examining the work of a plagiarist, you have a real problem, especially if he's an unethical one with a poor character, because he will steal the work of more principled men. And when he does, he sounds like a man of good character, a man of social reform, concern with social problems. But it's not really him. It's the person that he plagiarized. We know he did this in American Notes with regard to slavery. Okay, I've proven that he did this in A Christmas Carol. So there's no reason to assume that this introduction to Nicholas Nickleby is actually Dickens. So it's a problem. With any plagiarist, you got a serious problem. And this is why Matthew admired him too, because he was admiring the work of the people that Dickens may have stolen from, who had more real concern about social reform than he actually did. Now, in 1838, we have Barnaby Rudge. There's a preface there, and he talks about the ravens that he owned and so on. Matthew actually quoted that in an unsigned little essay in the Portland Transcript many years later. The one thing about this that stands out to me is that he's got a run-on sentence here that would, I can't think of a good analogy. He's got an incredible run-on sentence here. And I'm going to read it. Remember that Matthew believed in crisp writing. He wrote about that. He quoted somebody in that regard later on. So we know he did. His writing is crisp. The writing that used to be in A Christmas Carol before Dickens stretched it out was crisper than what Dickens published. And then this is what Dickens sounds like himself. I'm pretty sure there is no such sentence in any of Matthew's 2,300 published works that I have. He's talking about, let's see, a raven here. His gravity under those trying circumstances I can never forget, nor the extraordinary gallantry with which, refusing to be brought home, he defended himself behind a pump until overpowered by numbers. It may have been that he was too bright a genius to live long, or it may have been that he took some pernicious substance into his bill and thence into his maw, which is not improbable, seeing that he new pointed the greater part of the garden wall by digging out the mortar, broke countless squares of glass by scraping away the putty all around the frames, and tore up and swallowed in splinters the greater part of a wooden staircase of 6 steps in the landing, but after some 3 years he too was taken ill and died before the kitchen fire. Well, that's quite a sentence. There's something very interesting in it, though. If you read between the lines, I gather that he was captured and a whole bunch of people rushed at him and captured him. Well, I don't know how long after that he died, but probably people who keep birds will tell you that that's very traumatic for a bird, okay? Being captured by a great number of people descending on him and grabbing him, see, I mean, birds are kind of fragile, I think, emotionally, and basically you don't want to do that. So, but Dickens is oblivious to that. He just passes right on by it. He had no compassion for the bird or no concern about the fact that that could very easily traumatize a bird to the point that it would die, I'm not a bird person, but I'm guessing if I was to write to bird experts and say if a whole bunch of people, rushed on a bird and captured it, and grabbed it, while it was struggling, would that be traumatic to it? I'm guessing it would be. That's neither here nor there. Then we have Martin Chuzzlewit, 1842. This is still before the Christmas Carol was published. Here we have another character sketch of the Chuzzlewit family. It's sarcastic. There's no point in going over that too much. Now, here's something that lets you know that Matthew was a fan of Dickens around this time. There's a letter from Matthew to his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, dated February 13, 1844. He says, I send thee by same mail as this, the last number of Martin Chuzzlewit. Apparently this is during the period that Dickens was starting to satirize the United States. It is, I think, the best one which has yet appeared. Quote, the native American raw material and the American eagle are very happily treated. I always liked Dickens' works, but since he has had the boldness to attack our foolish vanity, maugre the stuffing and feasting they gave him, he has risen much in my estimation. When I have heard the boastful language of our sixpenny newspapers, and seen the absurd worship bestowed upon the memory of Washington, I have always felt that sensible foreigners must be disgusted with us. We are perhaps passable, and Washington may have done as well as another placed in his situation would, but that is the end of the matter. He was not a god, and we are not angels. So there Matthew is defending Dickens in his criticism of America. He was quite loyal. This would have been after Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, and not long after, because this is February of 44. This would be, I would guess, not long after it came to Matthew's attention, because I don't know that it would have come over from England, immediately. And he's defending Dickens. So he feels very much, I think, as someone would feel if they had composed a little song on their guitar in their apartment and they had sent it, to John Lennon or Paul McCartney back in the day. And lo and behold, the next Beatle album that comes out has got his song in it, changed up somewhat, maybe kind of dumbed down a little bit, but in some ways, spiritually, who knows. But nonetheless, the Beatles actually published his song, and he would be elated. He would be thrilled at first. Now, if the Beatles actually, became famous largely because of that song, and they continued to claim that it was theirs and that they wrote it, it might be a little different story, see, which I think is what happened in this case with A Christmas Carol. But early on, Matthew was thrilled. Now, I'm sorry that took so long. I'm going to edit a little bit of it down, especially my missteps and things. It's very early in the morning. I haven't had near enough sleep, and you know the drill. So what we're going to do here is to briefly get into some of these pieces signed Poins, again, because I can absolutely prove that Matthew was the author. There's other pieces that I know that Matthew wrote through rather torturous detective logic, and I'm not going to go into that. It would take too long, and it wouldn't convince the skeptics anyway. So this is a volume of the Portland Transcript. It goes from October 23, 1841 to March 25, 1843. I guess a library probably owned this before I got it. It's totally amazing that you can actually find these things. And except for two, I have physical copies of everything here that I'm going to share with you. The first one is in the December 17, 1842 edition, and this is the Avalanche essay that John Greenleaf Whittier referenced in his letter. Remember, he said on February 7, 1843, or a couple months later, "We were much amused by thy article in the Transcript about avalanche slides, etc." So this is unsigned, but here there's no question that this, first off, it's Matthew's style, and secondly, John Greenleaf mentioned it, and there's nothing else about avalanches in here. So this is Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is about, it's in Portland, where I am now, and it's about snow gathering on the eaves and then falling off on people. Avalanches, street scenes in winter. There is an awful sublimity in the deep-toned thunder as it follows the blinding flash of the fierce red lightning, and in the wild wrath of the hurricane as it rushes in its strong career, bowing the sturdy monarch of the forest, and madly rioting with the billows of the deep. But among all the operations of nature, we have ever considered the avalanche as foremost in awful grandeur and terrible sublimity. What feelings of awe arise as we stand at the base of the White Mountains and contemplate the path of the one which a few years since buried in its descent the unfortunate Willie and his family. As we look upon the immense pile before us, and then glance at the fearful road it traveled, to the dizzy and dimly seen height where it was first put in motion, this is a quote from poetry, our thoughts are strange, magnificent, and deep. And when we think of the glaciers of the ever-frozen north, where the snows of 1,000 winters, gradually undermined by some secret agency, leave their long resting places amid the clouds, moving slow and majestically at first, until at last, gathering power as they descend, the mighty masses come thundering to the valleys below, jarring to their very centers the ice-clad hills around, but we are off the track. So again, we have a serious philosophical introduction to a humorous piece. And Matthew quoted poetry quite a bit because he was very well read. This is typical MFW style. And I have to say that my own emotional past life memory, which I have all of Matthew's emotions readily available, and his motives, which is kind of interesting. Nobody believes me, I think, but I do. So I try to be truthful, and that's the truth. So I can feel what's going on here. John Greenleaf Whittier, of course, is already, I think, famous. He'll be much more famous when he releases the poem Snowbound in 1966, but he's still famous. And Matthew is trying to show him or impress him that he's every bit as good a writer. And what he gets back is, we were much amused by thy article in Transcript about avalanche slides. And he likes the other one very much. It's like when I send the link to my article, my paper, and I get back, I liked it, it's interesting, keep up the good work, have a good day. Very similar kind of response. In other words, this is excellent work. It's not just amusing. You understand? So I can feel this, the frustration, of being kind of patted on the head. See, his big brother is patting him on the head instead of saying, you're actually a better writer than I am, So anyway, we're going to move on. The other one that he mentions, I think, is in the back here. Let me find that real quick. February 4, 1843 is the first number, Wanderings in the East. And it so happens that in this same edition of the Portland Transcript, a couple pages over, is reprinted The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, reprinted from The Pioneer for January, it says. Well, we won't talk about Poe now, that's coming up later. But the point is that Matthew is a colleague by rights of Edgar Allan Poe, publishing at the same time. And there's actually work that's rather similar, written originally by Matthew during this period, which I'm not going into today. It starts in much the same way, with beautiful, lavish prose, descriptions of nature. So I'll just start this out. Eastport is the cleanest, nicest, and best arranged little place one can well conceive of, especially if one's conceptions, and indeed all his other faculties, both mental and physical, have been impaired and confused by the monotonous discomforts attending the 2 days' passage across the, quote, down east desert between the Penobscot and St. Croix. And then he goes on like that. I won't continue with that. But that's the piece that John Greenleaf Whittier was referring to. And it is, in fact, signed Poins, because under the title it says by Poins. Okay, so now this is all Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. We're now going to go to an essay on Christmas. And the relevance of this, of course, is that Matthew was very interested in Christmas, and that he saw the way Christmas was celebrated in Europe as superior to the way it was celebrated, or hardly celebrated, in America, which is the point of the essay. So this is in the December 24, 1842 edition, right before Christmas, the year before A Christmas Carol was published. It's definitely by Matthew because it's signed Poins. Let's see, we'll just maybe read the first paragraph and then dip into it a little bit. We ever hail with gladness the annual return of our New England Thanksgiving festival. It comes laden with associations dear to every true-hearted son of the pilgrim land. He loves to travel back in the road of memory to that remote period in the history of the New World when it was first instituted, and contemplate the stern integrity and fervent, though perhaps somewhat erring, piety of its founders. Remember, this is written by a Quaker now, and the Quakers were persecuted by the Puritans. And with no less pleasurable emotions do we greet the birthday of our national freedom, and as we are awakened by the cannon's voice heralding in the glorious day, as we look out and behold the proud banner of our country floating on the genial summer airs, our heart is always glad, and we bless God that, quote, the lines have fallen to us in pleasant places, I don't know what that's from, and that this is the land of our birth. But the emotions we have mentioned are local. The field is not broad. In the one case, we feel as a New Englander, and in the other as a citizen of these United States. But with regard to Christmas, the case is different. Here, no, quote, pent Utica restricts us, confining our feelings in its narrow walls, as in those cases. There, we merely felt as a citizen, here as a man. One of the first commemorates a grand epoch in the history of a people, a fragment of the mighty mass. This pertains to a world. It commemorates the most important and most stupendous event in its history, from the time when, in obedience to the fiat of Jehovah, it assumed its form to the present, the incarnation of the eternal God. Now you see, first off, that Matthew is a Christian, a sincere Christian. Dickens kind of gave it lip service. So that's one significant difference. Now, let's see. He goes on about England versus America. In no country, perhaps, where Christianity bears sway, is the natal day of its illustrious founder so little observed as in ours. True, we all recognize its annual return, and by some sects it is observed with due solemnities. But we fall far short in this respect when compared with other Christian nations. England, our motherland, far exceeds us in outward manifestation of veneration for the day. Who that reads is not familiar with the universal joy and hilarity of the Christmas days in merry old England? And he goes on about the superiority of the way Christmas is celebrated in England. If A Christmas Carol invented Christmas, which it did not, this is the real author that did so, not Charles Dickens. You understand? And this is why. Because he wanted to see Christmas celebrated more the way that it was in England. And this is why he set A Christmas Carol in England. Matthew had lived for years in New York City, so he knew the life of a big city, but he also was an avid reader, and he understood what was going on in England. And he wrote many stories set in foreign lands, in South America and Spain and, England and many other places. So it's perfectly in character for him to have written a story about the way Christmas is celebrated set in England and in London. Now, what do we have next here? This is something about the new year. It comes very soon afterwards. This is the December 31, 1842 edition, so the very next edition. And I won't go into this too much. It's signed by Poins. He quotes Young. I'm not sure who that is. The bell strikes one. We take no note of time, but from its loss. To give it then a tongue is wise in man. And that's his opening quote. Matthew often quoted poetry. As I said, he was very widely read. I don't know that Dickens did that. I don't think it's found in A Christmas Carol. I don't think there are quotes in there. And he writes, just to open it, another is added to the long catalogue of hurried years, gone like its predecessors, scored with the bright and dark records of human virtues and human vices. Those records are indelible and may not be erased or changed. No regrets can recall what we may now feel to be misused time. Its course is ever forward to the goal of eternity. God grant that in the year just past, the lighter may predominate over the darker shades in its register of our actions. Again, it's a philosophical introduction. Matthew was really, first and foremost, a philosopher, but he rarely formally put himself out in that capacity. His philosophy was in his prose, but he often put it in his introductions. That's signed Poins. Next we have, that's the Wanderings of the East, and then we have the Telltale Heart that I marked. So now we have to go to 1843, where I do not have a physical copy. And we're almost done. There's only a couple of these here. So the first one is where he first introduces his fictional town of Hornby, which is in Oxford County, which is just above where I am here in Portland, about an hour's drive, in a fictional town called Hornby. And here he's satirizing mesmerism or hypnosis. Now, Abby's first cousin was Charles Poins, who introduced mesmerism to America, and Matthew actually wrote a little eulogy for him after his death in the Portland Transcript, signed with his own initials, so we know for sure it's his. They were friends, but Matthew early on was skeptical, and gradually his skepticism evolved into belief, and not just blind belief, but, he'd investigated these things. So still here we see some of his skepticism because he's painting a picture of a couple scam artists who pretend to be real hypnotists, and they come to Hornby. And that's what this whole story is about. Again, it's signed Poins, and it opens as follows. There was, to use the language of an eyewitness, a great to-do and frustration in the usually quiet village of Hornby, when it was ascertained one afternoon in the summer of 18 that two strangers had arrived in the mail. The mail was carried by Colonel Jehu Fish in a wagon that morning and had taken lodgings at the Commercial Hotel in Hornby Exchange, such being the lofty titles supported by a little story-and-a-half building owned and kept by Deacon Joshua Jones, Esquire. We presume that all our readers are familiar with the history of Hornby. If not, we are sorry to say that at present it is not in our power to enlighten them, i.e. as to details. We can only give them a mere abstract touching its boundaries, origin, manner, and customs, and so on. Hornby, then, is situated in about the 45th degree north latitude, is bounded on all sides by, quote, down east, and was founded shortly after the Aroostook War. The face of the country is uneven. There are some hills and some hollows, but more rocks and stumps. The inhabitants are both carnivorous and granivorous, that is to say, they devour by turns pork and johnny cake. They are much given to whittling, guessing, and other intellectual amusements, and are considered by connoisseurs the most dexterous squirters of tobacco juice through their teeth in the known world. Politics, democratic to the core, that's conservative in that era. Religion, ditto. Exportations, charcoal and Chenango potatoes. Imports, New England rum, tobacco, and red herring. Now, this is a satire on the conservative country people in Oxford County. And I will say that the last time I drove up into Oxford County, there were Trump bumper stickers all over the place. So it hasn't changed a bit, I would say. And this is satire, but you will note that there's nothing about how funny it is that somebody would enjoy the execution of dogs and the murder of infants. You know, it's a little thing, but it's not a little thing. So that's Matthew's story, signed Poins, in the June 3rd, 1843 Portland Transcript before Christmas Carol was published. Now, the last one I'm going to look at is in the August 5th, 1843 edition. This is still before A Christmas Carol was published. And I think that Dickens was supposedly writing and actually reworking A Christmas Carol in the fall, but maybe it wasn't quite yet. This is called Knowing Men, and it prefigures one of Matthew's later Ethan Spike pieces, because we have a man giving a lecture in a little country town about astronomy when he actually doesn't know what he's talking about, the visiting lecturer. And I think this happened in Dover, New Hampshire, probably in 1837, when Matthew and Abby lived there, and it amused them. You know, it amused them so that Matthew wrote this story about it after her passing and published it in the August 5th, 1843 transcript. But this is his introduction. And once again, it's kind of a philosophical little introduction before he gets into the story. It's supposed to be the first of a series, but this happened quite often with Matthew, that he would start a series and then there'd never be any more of it. In every community that we are acquainted with, there are more or less of these characters. By the term knowing, we do not mean to convey an idea of extensive book knowledge, as the individuals to whom it is applied are always, quote, wise above what is written, and usually cherish a wholesome and becoming contempt for those productions which less favored mortals are wont to admire. So he's playing a double game here. He's satirizing people who think they know more than they really do. And at the same time, he's introducing himself as someone who actually does know more than the academics. Okay? So he's playing both sides of this on two different levels. Your true knowing man usually wears glasses and a cane. His pace is grave and thoughtful, and his general appearance altogether solemn and commendable. If his location is in some quiet country village, quote, from noise and bustle far away, I don't know what that quote's from, he shines with a peculiar luster. He is there the oracle, the very Alpha and Omega, the highest authority, from whose decisions there is no appeal. He is always possessed of the news in advance of the mail, and never, under any circumstances, allows himself to be betrayed into an expression of surprise. Has intelligence been brought to town by express of some awful and diabolical murder, at which everyone stands aghast, you shall see the knowing man, when some eager newsmonger gasping for breath imparts it to him, with various appalling additions and improvements, receive it all with a coolness and self-possession that operates as a perfect wet blanket on the ardor of the informer. So here, this is kind of subtle, but the fact that the knowing man is not impressed about the murder is integral to drawing the character of the man he is lampooning and caricaturing. Okay, it's not just a casual reference thrown in, And Matthew makes it clear that the diabolical murder is awful and everybody knows it's awful. Every normal person knows it's awful. It's not quite the same as what Dickens did with that reference to, executing dogs and murdering infants. It's very subtle, and I'm sure that people that can't sense it won't agree with me, but use your intuition on that. So that's just some examples of Matthew writing as Poins in 1842, 1843, still before A Christmas Carol was published. And the reason I'm doing this, I'm not going to be able to absolutely prove a point with this kind of thing. But the thing is that people know Dickens, or they think they know Dickens. What they actually know is the people he plagiarized from as much as him, I think. But they don't know Mathew Franklin Whittier. And they're not going to take the time to read his works. Not a single person in the world. I think there was somebody that casually asked if I could send all of Matthew's works to them, like I'm really going to do that. But there's nobody that has said, I would like to get to know Matthew's work better. Can you recommend some pieces? Can you share some of the things he wrote with me? Nobody's ever done that. Can you imagine? I provide good evidence that this was one of the real authors of A Christmas Carol, and I'm going to provide really good evidence that this was the real author of The Raven. And not a single person wants to dip into his work or Abby's work. It's unbelievable. So what I'm doing is just kind of familiarizing anybody who watches this blog with Matthew and with his work. And we're just now looking at the things that he wrote, that I'm sure he wrote, and I'm sure he was the author of, before A Christmas Carol was published, and before Charles Dickens ever started publishing fiction. With the understanding that Dickens was a plagiarist and could technically have accessed Matthew's work in the New York Constellation before he ever started publishing fiction. Okay? If the debunkers can do it, I can do it in terms of technical. So that's all for today. I'm going to go ahead and edit this. I don't have any real plans of doing anything else. I think I've delved into Abby's work as much as I really need to. There's a great deal there in terms of being precursors to A Christmas Carol, some of which I quoted in my paper. There's a great deal more there, which I don't think I will. I'm always hesitant to drag Abby or her work out in front of a potentially skeptical audience. I do to an extent as it's necessary, but only to a point. So there we have it. I hope you have a little better sense of Matthew's prose before A Christmas Carol was published, and I will see you next time.